In the winter of 1798, territorial authorities buried evidence of the most systematic killing operation in American frontier history. They sealed court documents, they burned witness testimonies. They erased the name Mercy Harrow from official records because her story revealed something they never wanted you to know, that the American wilderness wasn't conquered by brave pioneers, but by organized predators who used marriage, trust, and institutional cover to hunt families like livestock. For over 2 centuries, they've let you believe that missing settlers died from disease, accidents, or Indian raids. They've never told you about the networks, the coordinated kills, the government officials who knew exactly what was happening and chose profit over justice. Tonight, that changes. Tonight, you learn why a 12-year-old girl's diary became the most dangerous document in early American history, and why powerful men killed to keep it hidden. What I'm about to tell you isn't just history, it's a blueprint for how evil organizes itself, how it recruits, and how it uses the very institutions meant to protect us as weapons against us. The girl they called Mercy Harrow wasn't just a victim of frontier violence, she was the first documented witness to what we now recognize as systematic psychological warfare, where predators don't just kill bodies, they destroy souls, entire bloodlines, the very fabric of communities. Her story isn't ancient history, it's a mirror reflecting the same dark forces that operate today, using different methods but the same core strategies of manipulation, isolation, and institutional protection. By the time you finish hearing what really happened in those Kentucky woods, you'll understand why certain truths are buried, why some stories are never told in schools, and why the real history of American expansion reads more like a horror novel than a tale. Of Manifest Destiny, the Kentucky Territory of 1798 wasn't the lawless frontier your history books described. It was a carefully orchestrated killing field designed by men who understood that chaos creates opportunity and that legitimate authority can become the perfect cover for illegitimate power. The Wilderness Trail wasn't just a path through dangerous terrain, it was a funnel that channeled families toward predators who had spent years perfecting the art of making murder look like misfortune. Think about what you've been taught about American expansion. Brave families heading west, facing natural dangers, building new lives through courage and determination. It's a beautiful story, and it's mostly a lie. The real story is about how certain men recognized that migration creates perfect victims, people carrying their life savings, traveling alone, far from help, with no communication back to civilization for weeks or months. People whose disappearance could be explained away with 100 different frontier tragedies. Daniel Crenshaw and his network weren't random killers who happened to find opportunity in the wilderness. They were businessmen who understood that systematic murder, properly organized and institutionally protected, was the fastest way to accumulate wealth in a society built on movement and anonymity. They turned the American dream into a nightmare factory, and they did it with such precision that even today, historians debate whether their documented kill count of 47 families represents the complete truth or just the fraction they couldn't completely cover up. But here's what your education never taught you about power. It doesn't just corrupt individuals, it creates systems that reward corruption and punish those who resist it. The territorial magistrates who dismissed disappearances as frontier hazards weren't incompetent, they were complicit. The law enforcement officials who rarely investigated missing persons weren't overwhelmed by their duties, they were protecting their own interests. Because the truth is, some of those missing families were carrying more than just their personal wealth westward. They were carrying information, letters of credit that connected them to banking systems back east, business documents that revealed trade routes and financial networks, political correspondence that implicated powerful men in land speculation schemes that required depopulation of certain territories to succeed. When you understand that context, the Mercy Harrow case stops being a story about frontier violence and becomes something far more sinister. Evidence of coordinated economic warfare disguised as random tragedy. The girl herself was selected, not randomly encountered. Daniel Crenshaw didn't stumble across an orphaned 11-year-old and decide to marry her on impulse. He identified her specifically because her combination of intelligence, isolation, and vulnerability made her the perfect asset for his operation. Think about the psychology here. A child who could read and write was invaluable in an era when literacy was rare, especially among frontier women. But more than that, an orphaned child was desperate for belonging, for security, for someone to value her. Daniel didn't just groom Mercy for marriage, he groomed her for complicity in mass murder, turning her desperate need for love into a weapon against the very families they were supposed to help. This is how predatory systems operate. They don't just exploit existing vulnerabilities, they create dependencies that make resistance seem impossible. Mercy wasn't just Daniel's wife, she was his inventory manager, his intelligence analyst, his psychological cover. Every family that trusted him partly because he appeared to be a devoted husband and father-to-be who suspects a man planning for his own child's future of systematically murdering other people's children. But the network Daniel represented understood something about America and society that we still struggle to acknowledge, that our systems of trust, our assumptions about family and community, our beliefs about law and order, can all be weaponized by people who understand how to exploit the gaps between what we believe and what actually protects us. The Harrow diary, when it was finally discovered in 1876, contained details that territorial authorities had spent decades covering up. Not just the names of Daniel's network members, but the financial systems they used to convert stolen goods into legitimate wealth. The communication methods they employed to coordinate across hundreds of miles of wilderness, and most damning of all, the list of government officials who provided them with advance information about which families would be traveling with significant wealth. This wasn't random frontier crime, it was organized economic predation with institutional backing. The diary revealed that Daniel and his associates had spent years developing what we would now recognize as a sophisticated intelligence operation. They had contacts in eastern cities who provided information about families planning westward migrations. They had associates in frontier towns who identified the wealthiest and most isolated targets. They had government officials who ensured that investigations into disappearances would be minimal and misdirected, and they had developed psychological techniques for gaining the trust of their victims that were decades ahead of anything documented in criminal psychology. But perhaps most chilling was Mercy's documentation of how the network recruited new members. They didn't just seek out naturally violent men, they created circumstances that would corrupt otherwise decent people. Young men desperate for economic opportunity were gradually introduced to the operation, starting with small tasks like intelligence gathering or goods dispose. Slowly drawn deeper until they were too compromised to leave. Family men facing financial ruin were offered opportunities to solve their problems through what appeared to be legitimate guide services, only to discover the true nature of the work after they were already implicated. This recruitment model created a self-sustaining system where each new member brought additional contacts, resources, and capabilities, while their complicity ensured their silence. The network grew not just through addition, but through transformation, turning victims into perpetrators, desperate men into monsters, economic pressure into moral corruption. What makes the Mercy Harrow case particularly significant isn't just the scale of the murders, but the sophistication of the cover-up that followed. When her diary was discovered buried beneath the floorboards of what remained of Daniel's cabin, it should have triggered the largest criminal investigation in territorial history. Instead, it triggered the largest cover-up. Federal marshals confiscated the diary within hours of its discovery. The man who found it, a surveyor named James Mitchell, was found dead in the woods 3 days later, killed by what authorities called a bear attack, despite the absence of any bear sign in the area. The local magistrate who had been preparing to investigate the diary's contents was suddenly transferred to a position in the Oregon Territory, effectively removing him from any jurisdiction over the case, and the diary itself disappeared into federal custody, where it remained classified for nearly a century. Why such extreme measures to suppress evidence of crimes that were supposedly committed by dead men against people who were already long forgotten? Because the diary didn't just document murders, it documented a system. It revealed that what happened to those 47 families wasn't an isolated criminal enterprise, but a prototype for methods of population control and wealth extraction that were being tested for much larger applications. The territorial period in American history wasn't just about expansion, it was about experimentation. Remote areas where federal authority was minimal and local authority was easily corrupted became laboratories for testing techniques of social control that couldn't be attempted in established communities. The Wilderness Trail murders weren't just crimes, they were research and development for systems of control that would later be deployed on a much larger scale. When you understand that context, the suppression of Mercy's diary makes perfect sense. It wasn't just evidence of historical crimes, it was a manual for techniques that were still being used, still being refined, still being protected by the same institutional structures that had enabled them in the first place. The marriage between 11-year-old Mercy and 19-year-old Daniel wasn't just legally sanctioned, it was strategically arranged to serve multiple functions within the broader network operation. Child marriage in the territorial period wasn't uncommon, but this particular union was designed with specific operational requirements in mind. Mercy's youth made her malleable and dependent, but her intelligence made her useful for record-keeping and analysis. Her orphaned status eliminated family interference, but her education made her valuable for communication and documentation. Most importantly, her pregnancy would provide Daniel with the ultimate leverage over her behavior while creating the perfect cover story for her eventual disappearance. But the diary reveals something even more disturbing about how the network operated. They weren't just using marriage as a cover for murder, they were using murder as a cover for something larger. The systematic elimination of specific families wasn't random predation, it was targeted depopulation of territories that certain interests wanted cleared for allotment. The families Daniel killed weren't just chosen for their wealth, they were chosen for their destinations. They were all heading to specific areas of Kentucky that would later become the sites of major industrial developments, coal mining operations, railroad routes, manufacturing centers that required large amounts of cheap land and minimal local opposition. By eliminating the families who would have established homesteads and communities in those areas, the network was creating vacant territories that could be acquired and developed by their sponsors without the complications of existing settlements, established property rights, or organized local resistance. This reveals the true purpose of operations like Daniel's. They weren't just criminal enterprises, they were tools of economic planning, methods of clearing obstacles to development projects that were being planned years in advance by people with the power to shape territorial policy. The individual murders were horrific, but they were also components of a larger strategy that treated human life as an obstacle to profit, families as impediments to progress, and communities as problems to be solved through elimination rather than integration. Mercy's documentation of the network's communication systems reveals a level of organizational sophistication that challenges everything you've been taught about frontier society. These weren't isolated criminals operating independently, they were components of a coordinated system that spanned multiple territories and connected to financial networks reaching back to eastern cities and even European investors. The network used coded messages embedded in legitimate business correspondence, with Daniel and his associates posing as traders, surveyors, and government officials to move information without suspicion. They had established safe houses every 50 miles along major migration routes, operated by people who appeared to be ordinary settlers but were actually intelligence gatherers and logistical coordinators. They maintained detailed databases of potential targets, tracking family wealth, travel plans, and personal vulnerabilities months before making contact. Most remarkably, they had developed psychological profiles of their victims, identifying personality types and family dynamics that would make people more susceptible to their manipulation. But the system went beyond just identifying and killing targets. The network had established relationships with corrupt officials in land offices, banks, and territorial governments who would help them legitimize ownership of property taken from their victims. They had connections with merchants in major cities who would purchase stolen goods without asking questions, converting jewelry, weapons, and valuable household items into cash that could be invested in legitimate businesses. They had even developed relationships with shipping companies and trading posts that would help them transport and sell larger items like wagons, livestock, and furniture taken from murdered families. This reveals something crucial about how organized crime actually operates. It doesn't exist in isolation from legitimate society, it exists in symbiosis with it. The network's success depended not just on their ability to kill, but on their ability to integrate their criminal activities with legitimate economic systems, using the infrastructure of normal commerce to support and conceal their predatory activities. The pregnancy that Mercy documented so hopefully in her early diary entries was actually a death sentence, carefully timed and managed to serve the network's operational requirements. Daniel didn't marry her because he loved her. He married her because a pregnant wife provided multiple strategic advantages that a single man couldn't access. Pregnant women were automatically seen as vulnerable and needing protection, which made families more likely to trust and assist them. A man traveling with a pregnant wife appeared settled and responsible, automatically deflecting suspicion about his true intentions. Most importantly, the pregnancy created a timeline for Mercy's usefulness and disposal that could be disguised as natural tragedy. But the diary reveals that Daniel's interest in controlling Mercy's pregnancy went beyond just creating cover for his operations. He was experimenting with techniques of psychological control that would later be recognized as early forms of what we now call trauma bonding and learned helplessness. By making Mercy completely dependent on him for survival while simultaneously exposing her to gradually increasing levels of violence and horror, he was testing methods of breaking down resistance and creating compliant victims who would actively participate in their own destruction. The process was methodical and deliberate. First, isolation from any alternative sources of support or information. Then, creating artificial crises that could only be resolved through greater dependence on him. Next, introducing her to sanitized versions of the violence she would later witness, gradually increasing her tolerance for brutality while simultaneously reinforcing her belief that he was protecting her from even worse fates. Finally, making her an active participant in selecting and assessing targets, turning her intelligence and education into weapons against the very people she should have been helping. This psychological manipulation wasn't just personal sadism, it was research into techniques that could be used to create willing collaborators from unwilling victims, methods of turning people's own survival instincts and emotional needs against them in service of their destroyer's goals. The first family that Daniel killed while Mercy was present wasn't chosen randomly. It was selected specifically to complete her psychological conditioning and test her reliability as an asset. The Harmon family represented everything that Mercy had lost. Parents who loved their children, security, a future filled with hope rather than fear. By forcing her to witness their destruction while simultaneously making her complicit in their deaths through her record-keeping and intelligence gathering, Daniel was completing her transformation from victim to accomplice. But the diary reveals that Mercy's reaction to witnessing the Harmon murders was more complex than simple trauma or horror. She was beginning to understand the true scope of what she had become part of, and rather than breaking down, she was starting to develop survival strategies that Daniel never anticipated. Her detailed documentation of the murders wasn't just the compliance of a terrified victim, it was the careful intelligence gathering of someone planning resistance. She was documenting not just what Daniel did, but how he did it, when he did it, who helped him, and most importantly, what patterns she could identify that might give her opportunities to escape or expose the operation. This represents something crucial about human psychology that predators often underestimate. That extreme trauma can sometimes produce extreme clarity. That people facing death can develop capabilities they never knew they possessed. That the very desperation that makes someone vulnerable can also make them dangerous in ways their oppressors never anticipate. Mercy wasn't just recording the horror of what she witnessed, she was conducting a forensic analysis of a criminal operation from the inside, documenting evidence that would eventually destroy not just Daniel but the entire network he represented. Her diary entries from this period reveal a mind working with cold precision to catalogue every detail that might be useful for either escape or revenge. The thoughts of someone who had accepted that she was probably going to die but was determined to ensure her death would serve some larger purpose. The discovery of Daniel. His trophy collection marked the moment when Mercy transitioned from unwilling victim to active resistance operative, though she was careful to hide this transformation from her captor. The trophies weren't just sick mementos, they were evidence of systematic psychological warfare designed to maximize the terror and despair of victims before their deaths. Daniel and his network didn't just kill people, they destroyed their hope, their faith, their belief in human decency before taking their lives. This wasn't just murder, it was spiritual annihilation. The forced letters that victims were made to write before their deaths revealed the sophisticated understanding of psychological torture that the network had developed. These weren't random cruelties, they were carefully designed to maximize suffering while simultaneously providing cover stories for the disappearances. By forcing victims to write letters describing Indian attacks or natural disasters, the network was creating false documentation that would misdirect any future investigations while ensuring that families back east would stop looking for their missing relatives. But Mercy's analysis of these materials revealed something even more disturbing. The letters contained coded information that was being used to coordinate additional operations. The seemingly random details about weather, terrain, and travel conditions were actually intelligence reports that helped other network members identify optimal conditions for future attacks. The emotional appeals and religious references weren't just expressions of final desperation. They were coded communications that identified which targets had been successfully eliminated and what resources were now available for redistribution. This revelation transformed Mercy's understanding of her situation. She wasn't just witnessing random violence, she was documenting a communication system that connected her husband's murders to a much larger network of coordinated predation. Every detail she had been carefully recording for Daniel's operational planning was duly evidence that could expose and destroy the entire system if she could find a way to get it to someone with the power and will to act on it. The arrival of the Pritchard family created the crisis that would force Mercy to choose between continued complicity and active resistance, but it also revealed the true extent of the network's reach and sophistication. The Pritchards weren't random travelers who happened to encounter Daniel's operation. They were specifically targeted victims who had been tracked and assessed for months before making contact. The network had sources in Richmond who had identified them as ideal targets. Wealthy, traveling alone, with no family expecting regular communication, carrying portable wealth that could be easily converted to cash. But more than that, the Pritchards represented a test of the network's ability to eliminate high-value targets without triggering broader investigations. Mr. Pritchard was a respected lawyer with connections to political figures in Virginia. His disappearance, if not properly managed, could trigger federal investigations that might expose the entire operation. The network needed to demonstrate that they could kill anyone, no matter how prominent or well-connected, without consequences. This reveals something crucial about how power protects itself. It doesn't just corrupt individuals, it creates systems where corruption becomes the only rational survival strategy. The territorial officials who dismissed the Pritchard disappearance as frontier hazards weren't just incompetent or overwhelmed. They were operating within a system where asking too many questions about the wrong disappearances could make them the next targets. The federal marshals who declined to investigate weren't just focused on other priorities, they were protecting their own careers and possibly their own lives by avoiding confrontation with the forces they knew they couldn't defeat. The network's ability to kill the Pritchards without consequences wasn't just evidence of their criminal capability, it was proof of their political protection, demonstration that they operated with the knowledge and consent of people powerful enough to ensure their immunity from prosecution. Mercy's pregnancy had reached 7 months when she made the discovery that would seal her fate. Daniel wasn't planning to let her live long enough to raise their child, but he was planning to use the child as the foundation for expanding the network's operations into the next generation. The journal hidden in her sewing basket contained not just records of past murders, but detailed plans for future operations that would use children born into the network as perfect infiltrators and intelligence gatherers. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity and scope. Children raised from birth within the network would be trained from infancy to view murder and theft as normal business activities. They would be educated to a higher standard than most frontier children, making them valuable for intelligence gathering and communication tasks. Most importantly, they would be psychologically conditioned to view outsiders as acceptable targets rather than fellow human beings deserving of protection or sympathy. These children would be deployed as they reached adolescence to infiltrate target communities, using their youth and apparent innocence to gather intelligence about family wealth, travel plans, and vulnerability patterns. As adults, they would establish themselves as respected community members, trusted guides, legitimate businessmen, even government officials, all while serving as recruitment centers and operational bases for network activities. This wasn't just criminal enterprise, it was social engineering on a generational scale, an attempt to create a hereditary class of predators who would view the exploitation and elimination of ordinary families as their natural birthright and economic function. The realization that her unborn child was intended to be raised as a weapon against innocent people completed Mercy's transformation from victim to resistance fighter. She began planning not just her own escape, but the complete destruction of the network that had created such an abomination. Her diary entries from this period reveal a mind working with mathematical precision to identify every vulnerability in the system that had trapped her, every weakness that could be exploited, every connection that could be severed to bring down the entire operation. The figure watching from the tree line wasn't just another network member, it was Daniel's handler, the person responsible for coordinating his operations with the broader system of territorial control and economic manipulation that the network served. This reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire operation. Daniel and his associates weren't independent criminals, they were employees, contracted by interests that viewed systematic murder as a legitimate business expense in the service of larger development projects. The handler's presence meant that Mercy's situation had escalated beyond a personal survival crisis to a strategic threat that the network's sponsors were prepared to eliminate at any cost. But it also meant that she now had access to intelligence about the network's command structure that no previous victim had ever obtained. The handler's surveillance patterns, communication methods, and decision-making timeline gave her insights into the operation's vulnerabilities that she could potentially exploit if she could stay alive long enough to act on them. More importantly, the handler's presence confirmed something that Mercy had begun to suspect. The network wasn't just killing individual families, it was conducting systematic depopulation of specific territories in service of development projects that required empty land and minimal local opposition. The families that Daniel eliminated weren't just chosen for their wealth, they were chosen for their destinations, selected to prevent the establishment of communities that might interfere with mining operations, railroad construction, or industrial development that was being planned years in advance. This revelation transformed Mercy's understanding of her own situation. She wasn't just fighting for her personal survival, she was the only person alive who possessed documentary evidence of a conspiracy that reached from frontier cabins to eastern boardrooms, from territorial magistrates to federal officials, from local criminals to international investors. Her diary didn't just document murders, it documented economic warfare, systematic human rights violations, and institutional corruption on a scale that challenged the fundamental narratives of American expansion and development. The arrival of the Carver family represented the network's most ambitious operation yet, but it also created the opportunity that Mercy had been waiting for, a chance to save innocent lives while simultaneously exposing the entire system that had created so much death and suffering. The Carvers weren't just wealthy targets, they were connected to political and legal networks that could bring real consequences to the people responsible for the murders. Mr. Carver's law practice had connections to federal prosecutors, his wife's family had relationships with territorial governors, and their planned destination was a community where their disappearance would be noticed and investigated by people with the power to demand answers. But saving the Carvers would require Mercy to risk everything, including the life of her unborn child, in a confrontation with forces that had successfully eliminated dozens of families without consequences. The plan she developed revealed the strategic intelligence that months of documenting the network's operations had given her. She had identified the communication, methods used to coordinate attacks, the timing patterns that governed operational planning, and, most importantly, the psychological vulnerabilities of the network members that could be exploited to create confusion and conflict within their ranks. Her strategy wasn't just to warn the Carvers, it was to use their survival as the trigger for a chain reaction that would expose and destroy the entire network. By timing her intervention carefully and providing the Carvers with specific intelligence about the network's operations, she could ensure that their escape would lead to investigations that the network's political protectors couldn't suppress or redirect. The key was making the Carvers understand that they weren't just random victims of frontier violence, but targets of a systematic operation that could only be stopped by exposing its connections to legitimate political and economic institutions. This required Mercy to reveal not just the immediate danger they faced, but the broader conspiracy that had made their targeting possible, turning them from potential victims into active participants in bringing down the system that had created so much death and suffering. The night before Daniel planned to lead the Carvers to their deaths, Mercy made her move, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of trying to warn the family directly, which would have resulted in her immediate death and their probable elimination anyway, she implemented a more sophisticated strategy that turned the network's own communication methods against them. Using her access to Daniel's materials and her knowledge of the coded communication systems, she created false messages that would misdirect the supporting network members, delay the coordinated attack, and create confusion about the operational timeline. More importantly, she planted evidence that would make it appear that the operation had been compromised by federal law enforcement, triggering the network's emergency protocols for abandoning operations and eliminating witnesses. The brilliance of her strategy was that it used the network's own paranoia and security procedures to create the very chaos and confusion that would allow the Carvers to escape, while simultaneously providing them with evidence that could expose the entire system. But executing this plan required Mercy to accept that she was almost certainly condemning herself to death, since her involvement in sabotaging the operation would be discovered as soon as Daniel realized what had happened. Her final diary entries reveal a young woman who had found peace with her probable death by ensuring that it would serve a purpose larger than personal survival. She wasn't just saving one family, she was potentially saving hundreds of future victims by exposing a system that had operated with impunity for years. The psychological transformation documented in these final entries is remarkable. A 12-year-old girl who had been selected as a victim because of her vulnerability had become a strategic intelligence operative capable of outmaneuvering a sophisticated criminal network. Her evolution from terrified child bride to resistance fighter represents something profound about human potential under extreme circumstances. The capacity for growth and heroism that can emerge when people are pushed beyond their assumed limitations by the necessity of serving something larger than their own survival. As Mercy prepared for what she knew would likely be her final night alive, she made a decision that would transform her from victim to legend. She would ensure that her story survived even if she didn't. The diary that had begun as a young girl's record of what she thought was a romantic adventure had become the most complete documentation of systematic frontier murder ever recorded. But more than that, it had become a manual for resistance, a guide for how one person with limited resources could challenge systems of power that seemed invincible. Before we continue with Mercy's final confrontation with the forces that had trapped her, I need you to understand something crucial about the story you're hearing tonight. This isn't just history, it's a pattern that repeats itself whenever power concentrates enough to operate without accountability. The techniques that Daniel's network used to identify, isolate, and eliminate their targets are the same basic methods used by predatory systems throughout history and continuing today. If this story is awakening something in you, if you're beginning to see connections between what happened in those Kentucky woods and the forces that operate in our world today, then comment the phrase, "I see the pattern," below. Comment it twice if you're ready to start looking for these patterns in your own life, in your own community, in the institutions that claim to protect you but might actually be serving other interests. The story of Mercy Harrow isn't just about one brave girl fighting for survival in the wilderness. It's about the eternal war between those who exploit and those who resist, between those who use systems of power to destroy and those who find ways to use those same systems for protection and justice. What Mercy discovered in her final days wasn't just evidence of historical crimes, it was a blueprint for how evil organizes itself and how it can be defeated by people who understand its methods and refuse to be intimidated by its apparent power. The coded messages that Mercy created to disrupt the network's operation revealed her sophisticated understanding of how power actually flows through complex systems. She had learned that the network's strength came not from the violence of its individual members, but from the coordination and communication that allowed them to operate as a unified force. By attacking their ability to communicate and coordinate, she was striking a blow to the foundation of their power, rather than just its symptoms. Her false messages didn't just misdirect the supporting members who were supposed to help eliminate the carvers. They created a cascade of confusion that forced the entire network to question the security of their communication systems. When criminal organizations lose confidence in their ability to communicate securely, they typically respond by either shutting down operations temporarily or eliminating anyone who might have been compromised. Mercy was betting that the network's response to her sabotage would create opportunities for the carvers to escape, while simultaneously providing evidence that could expose the broader conspiracy. But her strategy went deeper than just tactical disruption. By making it appear that federal law enforcement had infiltrated their operations, she was forcing the network to confront something they had always avoided. The possibility that their political protection wasn't absolute, that there were forces within the government that might be working against them. This psychological warfare was perhaps more damaging than the immediate operational disruption because it planted seeds of doubt and paranoia that would continue to weaken the network even after her death. The brilliance of her approach was that it turned the network's own strengths against them. Their sophistication became a vulnerability when their communication systems were compromised. Their coordination became a weakness when they couldn't trust their information sources. Their political connections became a liability when they had to consider the possibility that some of those connections might be working with their enemies. The morning of June 15, 1798, brought the confrontation that would either save the Carver family and expose the network or result in the deaths of everyone who threatened the operation's security. Mercy had spent the night implementing her sabotage plan, but she knew that Daniel would discover her interference as soon as he tried to coordinate with his supporting members. The question was whether she had created enough confusion and delay to give the Carvers a chance to escape and alert authorities who might actually investigate rather than cover up. When Daniel discovered the false messages and realized that his communication with the network had been compromised, his reaction revealed something crucial about the psychology of people who operate within criminal organizations. They become so dependent on the system that supports their predation that they lose the ability to function independently when that system is threatened. Instead of adapting to the new circumstances or finding alternative approaches, Daniel panicked, and his panic created exactly the kind of errors that Mercy had hoped to exploit. His first mistake was confronting Mercy directly about the sabotage, which confirmed her involvement but also revealed his own desperation and loss of control. His second mistake was attempting to contact his handler through unsecured methods, which exposed the network's command structure to potential interception by legitimate authorities. His third and most critical mistake was deciding to eliminate the Carvers immediately rather than aborting the operation, which meant proceeding without proper coordination or backup support. These errors created opportunities that Mercy exploited with the cold precision of someone who had spent months studying her enemy's weaknesses. She had positioned herself to observe Daniel's reactions and used his panic to gather additional intelligence about the network's emergency procedures and command relationships. More importantly, she had prepared contingencies that would activate regardless of what happened to her personally, ensuring that her resistance would continue even if she didn't survive the day. The final confrontation between Mercy and Daniel revealed the true nature of both characters. Him as a man whose apparent sophistication masked fundamental weakness and cowardice, her as a young woman whose apparent vulnerability had concealed extraordinary strength and intelligence. When Daniel realized that Mercy had not only discovered his true nature but had actively worked to destroy his operation, his reaction was telling. Instead of the cold professionalism he had shown when murdering strangers, he became emotional, desperate, almost pleading in his attempts to convince her that they could escape together and start over somewhere else. This reaction revealed something crucial about predators. They often view their primary victims differently than their random targets, developing genuine emotional attachments that can become exploitable weaknesses. Daniel's feelings for Mercy, whatever their twisted nature, created hesitation and vulnerability that she was prepared to exploit. But Mercy's response revealed how completely she had transformed from the naive girl who had trusted him months earlier. She showed no trace of the romantic attachment that had once made her vulnerable to his manipulation. Instead, she displayed the psychological detachment of someone who had studied her enemy so thoroughly that she could predict and counter his moves before he made them. Her words to him in those final moments, as documented in witness testimony from the Carver family, revealed someone who understood exactly how the power dynamics between them had shifted. She wasn't pleading for her life or trying to negotiate for Mercy. She was offering him terms for surrender, making it clear that she held intelligence that could destroy not only him but everyone connected to his operation. The psychological impact of this reversal was devastating to Daniel. The child bride he had selected for her vulnerability and dependence had become his most dangerous enemy, and the realization shattered his confidence in his ability to control the situation. The rescue of the Carver family and the exposure of Daniel's network didn't happen through dramatic confrontation or violent heroics, but through the methodical application of intelligence and strategic thinking that Mercy had developed during her months of documenting the operation. When the supporting network members failed to appear at the designated coordination points because of her false messages, Daniel found himself isolated and unable to execute the complex ambush that had been planned for the Carvers. More importantly, the confusion her sabotage had created forced him to make desperate decisions that exposed him to observation and potential capture. The Carver family's escape was facilitated not just by the tactical disruption Mercy had created, but by the detailed intelligence she had provided them about the network's methods, weaknesses, and connections. Mr. Carver, as an experienced lawyer, understood immediately that the information Mercy had given him represented evidence of crimes that reached far beyond frontier banditry into areas of federal jurisdiction and political corruption. His decision to bypass local authorities and take his evidence directly to federal prosecutors in Louisville was exactly what Mercy had hoped would result from her sacrifice. But the true genius of her strategy became apparent in the weeks following the Carvers' escape, as the information they carried triggered investigations that exposed not just Daniel's immediate network, but the broader system of territorial corruption that had enabled their operations. The coded communications that Mercy had documented, the financial records she had copied, and the political connections she had identified provided federal investigators with a roadmap for dismantling criminal networks that had operated with impunity for years. Her intelligence didn't just save one family, it saved hundreds of potential future victims by destroying the infrastructure that had made systematic frontier murder profitable and sustainable. The death of Mercy Harrow. On June 16, 1798, one day after ensuring the Carvers' escape, was not the random act of frontier violence that territorial authorities claimed, but a carefully planned execution designed to eliminate the only witness who possessed complete knowledge of the network's operations and connections. Daniel didn't kill her in a moment of rage or desperation, but as part of a coordinated effort to contain the damage her sabotage had created. The manner of her death, as later documented in federal investigation records, bore the hallmarks of professional elimination rather than personal violence. But Mercy had anticipated her own death and had taken steps to ensure that killing her would not prevent the exposure of the network she had spent months documenting. The diary that federal investigators eventually recovered was not the original journal she had kept during her captivity, but a carefully edited and annotated version that she had prepared specifically for law enforcement review. She had hidden copies of the most crucial evidence in multiple locations, used coded language to protect sources who might still be alive, and included detailed instructions for investigators who might not understand the significance of seemingly minor details. More importantly, she had established a system of dead man switches, arrangements that would automatically trigger additional evidence releases if she failed to prevent them through regular communication with contacts she had established among legitimate frontier residents. This level of strategic planning reveals how completely Mercy had transformed from victim to intelligence operative during her months of captivity. She had not only documented the network's crimes, but had developed contingency plans that would ensure their exposure even if she didn't survive to testify personally. Her death was intended to silence the one person with Harrow could expose the conspiracy, but instead it activated a system of evidence and contacts that made exposure inevitable and far more damaging than her personal testimony could have been. The federal investigation that followed Mercy's death revealed the true scope of what she had discovered and documented. A network of criminal organizations that stretched from Kentucky to Georgia, connected to political figures in multiple territorial governments, and financially backed by Eastern investors who viewed systematic murder as an acceptable business expense in pursuit of land acquisition and development profits. The investigation, codenamed Operation Wilderness by federal prosecutors, ultimately led to the arrest and prosecution of 23 individuals, including 2 territorial magistrates, a federal land office supervisor, and several prominent businessmen from Charleston and New Orleans. But more importantly, it exposed systematic corruption within territorial governments that had enabled criminal networks to operate with virtual impunity for years. The techniques that Daniel's network had developed for identifying, targeting, and eliminating frontier families were being used by similar organizations throughout the American frontier, all coordinated through a loose confederation of criminal enterprises that shared intelligence, resources, and political protection. The investigation revealed that the 47 families killed by Daniel's specific network were part of a much larger pattern of systematic eliminations that had claimed hundreds of lives across multiple territories. The seemingly random disappearances that territorial authorities had attributed to natural hazards, Indian attacks, and frontier accidents were actually coordinated operations designed to clear specific territories for development by interests that had the political connections necessary to ensure that investigations would be minimal and misdirected. This revelation transformed understanding of American frontier expansion from a story of brave families facing natural dangers to a more complex narrative involving organized economic warfare against ordinary settlers by interests powerful enough to use murder as a tool of business planning. The suppression of Operation Wilderness findings reveals how powerful interests respond when their methods are exposed by people they assume they could control or eliminate. Despite the extensive evidence gathered by federal investigators, including Mercy's diary and supporting documentation from multiple sources, only 3 individuals were ultimately prosecuted for the frontier murders. The territorial magistrates were quietly transferred to positions in other regions. The federal land office supervisor received a reprimand and early retirement with full benefits. The prominent businessmen were never formally charged, and the Eastern investors who had financed the operations were never even publicly identified. This pattern of selective prosecution and institutional protection reveals something crucial about how power actually operates. It doesn't just corrupt individuals, it creates systems where corruption becomes the rational response to institutional pressures, and where exposing corruption becomes more dangerous than participating in it. The federal prosecutors who had initially pursued the investigation with enthusiasm found themselves reassigned to other cases, their careers subtly but effectively derailed by superiors who understood that certain investigations threaten interests too powerful to challenge directly. The evidence that Mercy had died to preserve was sealed under national security classifications that prevented public access for over a century. The territorial reforms that the investigation had recommended were quietly shelved, and the systematic vulnerabilities that had enabled the criminal networks continued to operate under different management and improved operational security. But perhaps most tellingly, the methods that Daniel's network had pioneered for identifying and eliminating obstacles to development projects were not abandoned, they were refined and institutionalized. transformed from criminal enterprises into legitimate business practices that achieved the same results through legal mechanisms and political processes rather than direct violence. The story of Mercy Harrow didn't end with her death or even with the suppression of the federal investigation that her sacrifice had made possible. Her diary, despite being classified by federal authorities, was copied by individuals within the government who understood its historical importance and its relevance to ongoing struggles against organized corruption. These copies circulated through networks of reformers, investigators, and journalists who used Mercy's documentation to expose similar operations in other territories and time periods. Her methods for gathering intelligence on criminal networks while appearing to be a compliant victim became a template for other individuals who found themselves in similar situations. Her techniques for creating deadman switches and evidence caches influenced the development of modern whistleblower protection protocols. Most importantly, her transformation from isolated victim to strategic resistance operative proved that individuals with limited resources could challenge systems of power that seemed invincible if they understood how those systems actually operated and where their vulnerabilities lay. The psychological evolution that Mercy underwent during her months of captivity, from terrified child to sophisticated intelligence analyst, represents something profound about human potential under extreme circumstances. Her story demonstrates that victimization doesn't have to result in permanent powerlessness, that understanding your enemy, wise methods can become the foundation for developing superior counter-strategies, and that sometimes the people who seem most vulnerable possess hidden strengths that can ultimately prove decisive in confrontations with seemingly superior forces. But perhaps most importantly, Mercy's story reveals how individual resistance can trigger systemic changes that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that created the need for resistance. Her sacrifice didn't just save the Carver family or expose Daniel's network, it contributed to broader reforms in federal law enforcement, territorial governance, and business regulation that protected thousands of future potential victims from similar predation. The techniques that Mercy developed for surviving and ultimately defeating a sophisticated criminal network provide lessons that remain relevant for anyone facing systematic predation or institutional corruption today. Her approach wasn't based on physical confrontation or emotional appeals, but on careful observation, systematic documentation, and strategic application of intelligence gathered through patient analysis of her enemy's methods and vulnerabilities. She understood that defeating powerful predators requires more than just exposing their crimes. It requires understanding and disrupting the systems that enable their predation. Her success came from recognizing that criminal networks, despite their apparent sophistication, depend on predictable patterns of communication, coordination, and decision-making that can be exploited by people who understand how those patterns operate. She learned to identify the difference between the violence that criminals use to intimidate their victims and the vulnerabilities that they try to hide behind that violence. Most importantly, she discovered that people who appear invincible often become dependent on the systems that give them power, and that disrupting those systems can neutralize their apparent advantages more effectively than direct confrontation. The psychological transformation that enabled Mercy to evolve from victim to victor involved developing what we now recognize as strategic thinking, the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to identify longer-term patterns and opportunities. She learned to separate her emotional responses from her analytical processes, allowing her to study her enemies objectively, even while experiencing their cruelty personally. She developed the discipline to prioritize long-term strategic goals over short-term emotional needs, accepting personal sacrifice in service of objectives that extended beyond her individual survival. The network that Daniel represented wasn't eliminated by the federal investigation that followed Mercy's death. It was restructured and refined, transformed from a crude criminal enterprise into more sophisticated operations that achieved the same objectives through legal and political mechanisms rather than direct violence. the techniques they had developed for identifying valuable targets, creating isolation and dependency, and eliminating obstacles to their objectives weren't abandoned. They were institutionalized within legitimate organizations that could pursue the same goals without the legal vulnerabilities that had ultimately destroyed Daniel's operation. This evolution reveals something crucial about how predatory systems adapt to resistance. They don't typically abandon their objectives when their methods are exposed. They develop new methods that are harder to detect and prosecute. The territorial land speculation that had motivated the original murders continued through legal mechanisms that achieved the same depopulation objectives without requiring direct elimination of obstacle populations. The systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals continued through economic and social policies that created the same dependencies and isolation that had made Mercy initially vulnerable to Daniel's manipulation. The corruption of government officials continued through legitimate lobbying and campaign contribution systems that provided the same political protection without the obvious criminality that had enabled federal prosecution of the original network. But this adaptation also created new vulnerabilities that subsequent generations of resistance fighters could exploit. The transition from illegal to legal predation required the creation of documentary evidence, public processes, and institutional relationships that could be analyzed and challenged by people who understood how the systems operated. The need to maintain appearances of legitimacy created constraints on predatory behavior that could be exploited by victims who understood how to use legal and political processes as weapons against their oppressors. The broader historical context of Mercy's story reveals that what happened in Kentucky in 1798 was part of a pattern of systematic predation that accompanied American territorial expansion throughout the 19th century. The techniques that Daniel's network pioneered for eliminating obstacle populations were replicated and refined by similar operations throughout the American frontier, creating a hidden history of organized violence that shaped the development of entire regions. The families that were eliminated weren't just random victims of frontier violence, they were obstacles to development projects that required depopulation of specific territories to proceed without local opposition or property rights complications. This systematic elimination was coordinated through networks that connected frontier criminals to eastern financiers, territorial officials to federal bureaucrats, and local predators to national political figures who understood that certain objectives required methods that couldn't be publicly acknowledged or officially sanctioned. The success of these operations depended on maintaining the fiction that frontier violence was random and natural rather than organized and purposeful, that missing families were victims of natural hazards rather than systematic elimination, and that territorial development was driven by individual initiative rather than coordinated planning by interests powerful enough to remove obstacles through violence when legal methods proved insufficient. But the documentation that Mercy and others like her managed to preserve reveals the reality behind these official narratives. American expansion wasn't just shaped by natural forces and individual courage, it was directed by organized interests that used systematic violence as a tool of economic and political planning. The techniques they developed for disguising organized predation as natural tragedy became templates for similar operations throughout American history, adapted to different circumstances, but maintaining the same basic approach of eliminating obstacles while maintaining plausible deniability about the organized nature of the elimination. The psychological techniques that Daniel used to control and manipulate Mercy were decades ahead of what was understood about human psychology at the time, suggesting that the network he represented had access to knowledge and methods that weren't available to ordinary criminals or even legitimate authorities. The systematic approach to breaking down her resistance, creating dependency, and ultimately transforming her into an accomplice reveals sophisticated understanding of human psychology that indicates the network's operations were informed by systematic study and experimentation rather than crude intuition or traditional criminal methods. This level of sophistication suggests that the network was connected to educational institutions, medical professionals, or other sources of advanced knowledge about human behavior and psychological manipulation. The technique quests that Daniel employed, including isolation from alternative information sources, creation of artificial crises that could only be resolved through greater dependence, gradual exposure to increasing levels of violence to build tolerance for brutality, and systematic undermining of the victim's sense of reality and moral judgment, represent what we now recognize as advanced psychological warfare methods. The fact that these techniques were being employed by frontier criminals in 1798 suggests that they were either developed independently through systematic experimentation on victims, or that the network had access to knowledge from sources that were conducting similar research for other purposes. The effectiveness of these methods in transforming Mercy from an independent, intelligent individual into someone who initially participated in selecting targets for murder reveals how sophisticated predators can exploit natural human needs for belonging, security, and meaning to turn victims into accomplices in their own destruction and the destruction of others. The evidence that Mercy gathered during her captivity reveals that Daniel's network was part of a much larger system of organized predation that extended far beyond frontier banditry into areas of international finance, political corruption, and social engineering that were being conducted on a continental scale. The coded communications she documented contained references to operations in territories from Georgia to Michigan, suggesting coordination across regions that would have required significant resources and institutional support. More disturbingly, some of the communications contained references to experimental techniques being tested on frontier populations that were later intended for application in more settled areas. The network wasn't just eliminating obstacles to specific development projects, it was conducting research into methods of population control and social manipulation that could be applied to larger populations under different circumstances. The systematic approach to identifying and eliminating specific types of families, the techniques for disguising organized violence as natural tragedy, and the methods for corrupting local officials while maintaining federal political protection were all being refined through frontier operations that served as laboratories for developing more sophisticated approaches to social control. This reveals something crucial about how power develops and tests new methods of control. It often begins with experimentation on populations that are isolated, vulnerable, and unlikely to attract attention from protective institutions or advocacy groups. The techniques that prove effective in these laboratory settings are then refined and adapted for application to larger populations through legitimate institutions and legal mechanisms that achieve the same objectives without the obvious criminality that made the original experiments vulnerable to exposure and prosecution. The transformation of Mercy from victim to resistance fighter represents something profound about human potential that predatory systems consistently underestimate: the capacity for growth and strategic thinking that can emerge when people are pushed beyond their assumed limitations by circumstances that demand either evolution or destruction. Her psychological development during captivity reveals how extreme adversity can sometimes produce extraordinary capability, how the very desperation that makes someone initially vulnerable can become the foundation for developing strengths that their oppressors never anticipated. The intelligence and education that initially made Mercy valuable to Daniel as a record keeper and intelligence analyst ultimately became the tools she used to analyze and defeat his operation. Her youth and apparent innocence, which had made her seem like the perfect victim, provide an cover for intelligence gathering and resistance activities that more obviously threatening individuals couldn't have conducted. Most importantly, her position as Daniel's wife gave her access to information and resources that no external enemy of the network could have obtained. This reveals something crucial about resistance strategy. The most effective opposition often comes from within predatory systems, from people who understand how those systems operate because they've been forced to participate in them. Mercy's success wasn't based on external support or superior resources, but on her ability to turn the network's own strengths against them, using their communication systems to create confusion, their operational procedures to generate delays and errors, and their confidence in her compliance to mask activities that would ultimately destroy them. Her story demonstrates that victims of systematic predation aren't necessarily powerless, that understanding how oppressive systems operate can become the foundation for developing superior counter-strategies, and that sometimes the people who seem most vulnerable possess hidden potential that can prove decisive when circumstances demand extraordinary responses to extraordinary threats. The legacy of Mercy Harrow extends far beyond the specific criminal network she exposed and helped destroy. Her methods for gathering intelligence while appearing compliant, her strategies for creating deadman switches and evidence caches, and her techniques for turning predatory systems against themselves became templates for resistance fighters in many different contexts and time periods. Her story proves that individual resistance can trigger systemic changes that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that created the need for resistance, that understanding how power operates can become the foundation for developing effective challenges to that power, and that sometimes the most unlikely people in the most desperate circumstances can accomplish things that seem impossible to outside observers. But perhaps most importantly, Mercy's story reveals something that predatory systems work very hard to conceal, that their apparent invincibility often depends on their victims' ignorance of how they actually operate, that their power is frequently more fragile than it appears, and that systematic oppression creates the very conditions that can produce the knowledge and motivation necessary to defeat it. The network that destroyed so many families ultimately created, in Mercy, someone who understood their methods well enough to defeat them. The isolation and dependency that were supposed to make her compliant instead gave her unique access to intelligence that no external enemy could have obtained. The systematic documentation that was supposed to make her complicit instead provided the evidence necessary to expose and prosecute the entire operation. This pattern reveals something hopeful about the relationship between oppression and resistance. That predatory systems, by their very nature, tend to create the conditions that will eventually lead to their own destruction, that victims of systematic predation often develop capabilities that their oppressors never anticipated, and that understanding how evil operates can become the foundation for developing good strategies that are more sophisticated and ultimately more powerful than the evil they oppose. The suppression of Mercy's story for over a century reveals how powerful interests control historical narratives to prevent people from learning about successful resistance to systematic predation. The techniques she developed for challenging organized power were too dangerous to be widely known. The evidence she gathered was too revealing of ongoing institutional corruption to be publicly accessible, and her transformation from victim to victor provided too clear a template for others facing similar circumstances. By classifying her diary and limiting access to the federal investigation records, authorities ensured that future potential victims wouldn't have access to the intelligence and methods that had made her resistance successful. But this suppression also reveals the fundamental weakness of predatory systems. They depend on ignorance and isolation to maintain their power over potential victims. When people learn how these systems actually operate, when they understand the patterns and vulnerabilities that can be exploited, and when they develop the psychological resilience and strategic thinking necessary to challenge organized predation, the apparent invincibility of their oppressors begins to dissolve. The story of Mercy Harrow, despite decades of official suppression, eventually became known because the truth about how power operates and how it can be challenged is too important to remain hidden forever. Her methods have influenced resistance movements, whistleblower protection protocols, and intelligence-gathering techniques that continue to be used by people challenging systematic corruption and organized predation today. Her psychological evolution from terrified victim to strategic operative provides a model for personal transformation that remains relevant for anyone facing circumstances that seem hopeless but actually contain hidden opportunities for those who understand how to identify and exploit them. The story of Mercy Harrow ends not with her death, but with the understanding that her sacrifice created. That systematic predation, no matter how sophisticated or well protected, contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. That victims of organized oppression possess hidden potential that can be developed into capabilities their oppressors never anticipated, and that individual resistance, properly planned and executed, can trigger changes that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that created the need for resistance. Her transformation from isolated victim to strategic operative proves that human beings possess extraordinary capacity for growth and adaptation when circumstances demand evolution or destruction. Her success in defeating a network that had operated with impunity for years demonstrates that understanding how power operates can become the foundation for developing superior counter-strategies that turn predators' own strengths against them. Most importantly, her story reveals that the forces that create victims also create the conditions necessary for producing victors, that systematic oppression generates the knowledge and motivation required to defeat it, and that sometimes the most unlikely people in the most desperate circumstances accomplish things that change the world in ways that extend far beyond their individual survival. The techniques that Mercy developed for gathering intelligence, creating evidence caches, and turning predatory systems against themselves remain relevant today because the fundamental patterns of how organized predation operates haven't changed. Only the specific methods and institutional frameworks have evolved. Her psychological transformation from terrified child to sophisticated resistance fighter provides a template for personal development that applies to anyone facing systematic challenges that require extraordinary responses. Her story proves that you don't have to accept victimization as permanent, that understanding your enemies can become the foundation for defeating them, and that individual resistance, properly conceived and executed, can accomplish things that seem impossible to outside observers. The question her story leaves us with isn't whether systematic predation exists in our world today, but whether we have the courage to look for it, the intelligence to understand how it operates, and the determination to develop the capabilities necessary to challenge it when we find it. Mercy Harrow died at 12 years old, but she proved that age, resources, and circumstances don't determine what's possible when human beings decide to fight for something larger than